Welcome to the Lawless Astrology channel. My name is Dabney, and today I'm super excited because I have someone that was requested. It was a fan favorite request, someone who I actually have never met before. Her name is Rosie Finn. And Rosie has been making the circuit promoting her new book called Persephone's Revolution. If you want to hold it up,
Here
Pluto's
we go.
Path to the End of Empire. And what she has done in this book that made it so enticing and interesting for people is that she has done research about how Pluto impacts the end of empires and what Pluto out of bounds looks like. And we'll explain a little bit about what that means. And so this is really in-depth research that she has been doing for many, many years. Rosie is an esoteric and Vedic astrologer. She's available for readings. But I think once you watch this, you may want to get her book. So if you are an astrology fan and you are kind of trying to make sense of what's happening, but also have a little faith that what is happening is for our greater good, I think there's some really juicy stuff in there that will help people understand that. So Rosie Finn, RosieFinn.com. Welcome, Rosie.
Thank you, Dabney. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely appreciate it. She's so sweet because I did a video and then I think it was like on Uranus and Gemini, and I had 3 comments from people like, have you seen this work? And I was like, no, I haven't. And so they just may be fans of yours in general. They may have been following you for many years or gotten readings from you. But I always love when people suggest astrologers that I've never heard of because it brings a whole awareness to topics that are out of my purview. And definitely Pluto being out of bounds is not something that is on my radar at all. So do you want to just kind of set the stage and talk a little bit about your research and your book and yeah, just what that even means, Pluto out of bounds?
Right. Well, I got into it back in 2001, 2002, when I took a class with Dr. Mitchell Gibson, who was talking about mystical quotient days, and he was looking at Mercury out of bounds. And he called it Mercury in extreme declination. So I started looking at other planets in extreme declination, Venus, and so when I started looking at Pluto, I noticed that when Pluto went out of bounds, really extraordinary events happened in history. And they were the kind of events I didn't know really much history at the time, but I recognized those dates as significant events, including World War II, including the American Revolution, including the time period of Genghis Khan, including the time period of Augustus Caesar. I mean, these are names that we mostly have heard of, right? And I, not knowing much history, said, well, is this significant? So I started studying history and looking at the cycle of Pluto going out of bounds. What was the difference between Pluto out of bounds to the north and Pluto out of bounds to the south? So quickly, when a planet's out of bounds, it has to do with declination. Declination is the measurement of a planet above or below the equatorial plane. You extend the equator out into space, and then you track the degrees above that or below that. And it's a lot about our perspective. What do we see as north of the equator? What do we see as south of the equator? So when I started looking at Pluto out of bounds, I also noticed, oh, now out of bounds is when a planet goes past 23 degrees, 27 minutes of north or south. And the reason that degree is because the Earth is at that degree of tilt. So when we're looking at perspective in space, we're looking at the tilt. Our planet's tilted in relationship to the orbital plane. So when a planet's to the north, we're looking at it from the perspective of how we're skewed. So it's a lot of geocentric, our perspective. So one of the things I noticed is that Pluto was going out of bounds for different lengths of time into different extremes. over time, which I started tracking and noticing that it used to go out of bounds for much longer and to much higher extremes. And this is because the tilt of the planet is changing.
That's very
So,
fascinating.
yeah, as our planet, it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure that out. I'm noticing, like, now that the book is out and other people are talking about it, that they're much more quickly understanding the phenomenon. But it took me, I think, about a couple of years of making little styrofoam models with pipe cleaners and like, why is this happening? And how is this happening? So what is happening is that because the tilt is changing and because Pluto's orbit is at 17 degrees inclined, it's moving so that Pluto is only going out of bounds past 23 degrees, 27 minutes one more time. And that begins this September for the next 10 years. And it won't go out of bounds again in the next Pluto cycle. So, after tracking the history of what Pluto does when it goes out of bounds, north and south, I feel a lot of hope. This is an interesting and intense next 10-year time period where really extraordinary things happen. And I know a lot of astrologers are looking at Pluto in Aquarius, and that's important. And a lot of the same themes apply, of course. Pluto's in Aquarius. But when it goes out of bounds, it's like the paradigm shifts. There's something really radically new that it comes onto the playing field, whether it's north or south. But there's a difference between north and south.
So let me interrupt you before we get to the difference between north and south, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I just want to back up a little bit. And, first of all, that was a great explanation. I'm going to be taking an astronomy course in August because like sometimes like I that is not my strong suit at all. Like I would have been right there with you. Like, why is this happening? Oh, the earth is tilting. Oh, why is the earth tilting? Like I have no idea. So I know a lot of people watching this channel are either new to astrology or, not necessarily professional astrologers. And a lot of the professional astrologers and astronomers obviously would know that, but kudos to you for figuring that out on your own, why this is happening. But one of the things that I wanted to just kind of give people sort of an illustration is if we look at a planet, when it goes out of bounds, either up high, like, usually a planet travels at certain degrees. And so when it gets to these really high degrees of like 23, 20, 27 minutes, that's when it's called out of bounds, or when it gets really low. And that can be a lot of different planets. Like you can have Mars out of bound in your own personal chart. And so that's where my basic knowledge of out of bounds planets, because that's never been a focus of mine, has just been the personal planets. So, and when you have an out of bound planet, usually that means there's kind of an extreme expression of that particular planet in your own personal chart. So let's say you have like Mars out of bounds, you might have this really strong energy of like needing to express that Mars in a unique way that's a little different than maybe somebody else's. That's my understanding of out of bound planets. Does that kind of align with your basic philosophy of them? Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing I've never really focused on too much is that the outer planets with out of bounds. Is that kind of one of those things that you look at more for collective mundane astrology, or do you look at that in a person's personal chart as well?
I don't look at it so much personally because the
Okay.
aspects move so slowly.
Right.
And I, the like Saturn and Jupiter and Uranus, Neptune, they are really neatly inside the orbital plane, right? They're like
Okay.
0 degrees. So if they do go out of bounds, it's very, very slight. At least
Okay.
that's my understanding. Pluto's the only like outer planet. I mean, the Kuiper Belt planets, and I have tracked these also go out of bounds into extreme. I mean, a lot of them even farther out, extreme declination. It's interesting that the Kuiper belt is a bit skewed in the same kind of like inclination, different degrees, but same direction that Pluto points to.
All right. Well, so I just wanted to back up and like kind of give people a sense of when we're talking about an out of bounds planet, why it would be even interesting or why we would pay attention to it more from like a qualitative standpoint than a quantitative standpoint. So that's a great explanation. So now let's talk about, I guess you said like there's out of bounds north and then there's out of bounds south.
Yeah. And I just also wanted to add, you were talking about Mars being out of bounds. And yes, the planet exhibits its most extreme. Like a lot of times we'll see explosions or wars or violence, an uptick in that when Pluto goes out of bounds, Mars goes out of bounds. And when Venus goes out of bounds, we see great works of art or people crazily falling in love. I think Van Gogh painted a lot of his great works when Venus was out of bounds. And then when Mercury's out of bounds, we see these brilliant ideas and inventions. Maxwell and Newton, Einstein, they all did some of their greatest work when Mercury was out of bounds. So I just wanted to add that.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I think that's super helpful. And we just have had Mars out of bounds in the
yes,
past year. And I think a lot of us were kind of like, well, when is this going to end? Because this is kind of intense.
yeah. Yeah, it's nice that that's calmed down.
Yeah. Nice that it's calmed down. So
But,
so you did this research, you recognized these kind of really almost infamous dates. And the two that struck out at me, you talked about World War II and the Revolutionary War and Caesar. So, Uranus is just moving into Gemini, which also has some correlations with World War II and the revolution. So, is there sort of this connection with out of bound planets and Uranian energy in some way? Do you just kind of kindred spirits or,
well, it has to do with the resonance of the planets, right? Pluto and Neptune have a 2-3 resonance, and Neptune and Uranus have a 1-2 resonance. So that means, and this is really fascinating, and in terms of this correlation and synchronicity in the universe, that Neptune goes into Aries. Whenever Neptune's gone into Aries for 1,000 years or so, Pluto has either been at its peak of declination, out of bounds, or it's been at 0 degrees declination. And then you add Uranus to it, which Uranus now Uranus isn't perfect, whereas Neptune, Pluto, that's perfection. That's 2-3 with barely an orb of influence. But so Uranus moving into Gemini has also been happening every time Neptune's moved into Aries for, the last few centuries. So it has a correlation because the planets have a correlation, right? And I think the world axis point, 0 degrees Aries, is really significant. I also think 0 degrees Gemini is so important because it's the Pleiades. And the Pleiades are this brilliant ancient, star system. I mean, it's all ancient, right? The stars, but our understanding and our connection to the Pleiades goes back to a lot of the indigenous culture traditions. So when Uranus is moving into Gemini, it's also bringing in or connecting to this brilliant star system. At the same
how
time, Neptune is at the world axis point at the same time that Pluto is out of bounds or at 0 degrees declination.
so when you talk about like 1, 2, and 2, 3, tell me what exactly that means.
Okay, so that means that for every 3 times that Neptune goes around, Pluto goes around 2 times. So,
Okay.
and it's perfect, like really, so you can track that. And then Uranus's cycle is 84 years, and Neptune's cycle is about 167. So that's about a 1-2. So Uranus goes around twice for every 1 time that Neptune goes around.
And where is the connection with the Pleiades? And you'll have to forgive me because
That's
as an
okay.
evolutionary astrologer, I study different things, but I love all this stuff. And I hear other astrologers talk about the Pleiades and, forgive my ignorance, but, I know, it's a star system, but that's about all I know. So like, how does that fit into it? And how did you get interested in it?
So I got into studying fixed stars like years ago. And first, I mean, I've been an astrologer for 30 years and I'm reading. So
Everything you
I
can get your
always
hands
like
on, right?
devouring things. Um, I, so I think actually it was Barbara Hand Clow who got me into the Pleiades. She wrote a book, The Pleiadian Agenda, back, well, in the 1990s, when I was getting into astrology. And then Barbara Marciniak wrote this great book called Bringers of the Dawn about the Pleiades. It's a channeled work. But there's like a lot of, it's the seven sisters usually. There's seven stars. The brightest star is Alcyon. It's about 1 degree Gemini. But the Pleiades go from about 28 degrees Taurus to about 2 degrees Gemini.
Okay.
So they cover that area of the sky. And there's maybe more in the esoteric world, like Alice Bailey, who wrote lots of great esoteric astrology books. She tuned into the Pleiades. Um,
So the
and
Uranus and Gemini piece really kind of activates that star system, and there's a real connection there, it sounds like.
yeah.
So, okay. So in your book, and I don't want you to have to give away too much of the book because I obviously want people to go and read it. I know I'm going to put it on my list. Talk to me about, sort of some of the aha moments that you got and the North versus the South out of bounds.
So this is where the hope starts coming in.
Okay.
Because Pluto out of bounds to the north is really different than what happens Pluto out of bounds to the south. When Pluto goes out of bounds to the north, it's in Leo, maybe n degrees of Cancer, the farther back you go, because it gets extended both time and in terms of the degrees are more out of bounds. And what happens then is empires build. That's when you see the dictators and we'll say the successful conquerors. Like in World War II, we had Stalin and Hitler, Mussolini. And also the corporate powers that really took on much more power during World War II. If
Was Pluto in Leo to the north during World War II, like beyond that, like into the 50s, or like how long of a period does that span?
uh,
I mean, roughly.
Pluto was out of bounds till about 1952.
Okay.
I know I shouldn't have to look this up, but
No, but I was just saying, like, if it goes beyond the 1950s, so then it's also like the empire building in the United States, where we kind of,
oh, this cycle is clearly the empire building of the United States. I
okay.
mean, really, bar none. We can look at the Soviet Union, and this cycle tracks really well with the Soviet Union. But the true empire building of this cycle is the US. We look at the past empire building, it was the French and the British. We go beyond that, and we have time period of the Catholic Church. We go past that, and we are looking at Genghis Khan and the Mongolian Empire. Um, so during Pluto out of bounds to the north, it's empire building. Pluto out of bounds to the south is the fall of empire. It's the revolutions. It's the Reformation. It's time period when people start reclaiming their power. So they give it up during Pluto to the north, where it feels like there's massive fear and loss of control and loss of power. And then when Pluto goes out of bounds to the south, people reclaim their power. They rise up, and we see successful revolutions. So there's revolutions that happen all during every cycle, but for a revolution to succeed or to really move the needle away from empire building, Pluto needs to be out of bounds to the south.
So,
We can like even see like back in 2011 when I was deep in the research, when there was a lot of uprisings in the Middle East in the Arab Spring, a little bit hurt my heart because I thought, they just need to wait till 2025, 2026, because that's when these can be successful instead of just kind of reverting back to either chaos or military control. Um, so
that's fascinating.
yeah.
Yeah. And so does that also kind of, so when Pluto, so let's say, okay, so the general you know, takeaway is Pluto out of bounds to the north, empire building, things getting, potentially, more restrictive, people relying on the empire, the power structure above more. When it comes to the south, there's a breaking point, things have gone too far, and there's uprisings and revolutions. Do we see that it always correlates with the primary empire being built during that cycle of out of bounds to the north with the primary cycle out of bounds to the south? Or is it kind of a mixed bag of like where the south uprises?
It pretty much correlates directly.
Okay.
You see the out of bounds to the south is rectifying the imbalances that happen when Pluto goes out of bounds to the north. In fact, I've also tracked Pluto at 0 degrees declination. So I start the cycle when Pluto is at 0 degrees declination, crossing the equatorial plane from south to north. And I've tracked that as the beginning because that's when the visionaries live. And where the visionaries live will also tell you which empire is going to grow and and watch the fall of that empire. So and then there's Pluto when it goes at 0 degrees declination from north to south. So there's 4 stages. And I call the first stage vision, the visionaries, the second stage power, when power is amassed. And then the third stage, justice, which isn't when we get justice, but when there's a cry for justice, when there starts to be, the shouting, the emperor has no clothes, look, we need to like change what's going on. Those people often are killed or, but they're shouting, they're saying, we need to change. And then the changes happen when Pluto goes out of bounds to the south. If we look at the prior cycle, so this cycle, first of all, the vision was the 1860s. So that was the American Civil War, and really the beginning of the robber barons, the beginning of corporate America, the beginning of a lot of technology. It was the beginning of Marx and Engels writing. Marx wrote Das Kapital in that time period. It was the beginning of Darwin. A lot about science and technology was beginning. Maxwell's equations, which all of our technology is based on. So that was the vision. If we go
And
back,
that also echoes like what you were saying, Neptune and Aries, because there's a connection there as well.
right?
And that was Neptune and Aries, which we are in as again now. So, okay, sorry.
Yeah,
Just want to kind of
no,
tie
that's
some
great.
pieces
Yeah,
together for people.
Neptune was in Aries, and yeah, and Uranus was also kind of close. I forget whether it was Taurus or Gemini at that time, but it was close into that also. Yeah.
So, so the vision began in 1860s in this cycle. And then when did it go out of bounds to the north then?
About 1938.
Okay.
So almost exactly. In the book, I track this more precisely. I'm not going to be able to
No, and
recall
that's the thing. People
exactly,
have to go buy the book to get
but
like the real juice. We're just giving them a taste here. So you do not have to be exact in any way, shape, or form.
okay, well, in the book, I talk about like even the difference between the Anschluss, which is when Germany just kind of walked into Austria, and then when it met the resistance in Poland. And you can even look at Pluto wasn't out of bounds during the Anschluss, but it went out of bounds when Germany invaded Poland, and which really got World War II started. It was also moved out of bounds during Kristallnacht, which is the beginning of really the Nazi Germany and the beginning of the Holocaust.
So in the beginning stages of it going out of bounds to the north, then it can almost be like seeds are planted that you don't know where it's going to go throughout the next um, 248 year cycle, or, or 120, whatever year cycle. So is that kind of how that works? Or like,
Yeah.
how long is it out of bounds for? Does it vary?
Yeah, it does vary. It used to go out of bounds for a lot longer. Um, so yeah, the vision, so the 1860, I mean, Marx didn't know where his work was going to go and what kind of empire it was going to build for the Soviet Union. I mean, he was German after all. Uh, and then Darwin didn't know what his theories were going to be taken over and used for. So yeah, the visionaries, they just have their visions. And I also think when Pluto goes out of bounds, like 1938, it seems that there's something about people not being prepared for it, not feeling like aware that it's happening. There's a sense that the dictators take advantage of people not being armed and ready and prepared for it. So I I think one of the things I'm seeing a lot of conversations about is that Pluto going out of bounds again could be like another World War II. But the thing is, when Pluto goes out of bounds to the south, people are ready. They're like, we don't want this to happen again. In the prior cycle, it started early 1600s, which was the beginning of colonization. It was a British Empire. It was the beginning of the East India Trading Company, which was really the corporation that set the stage for the British Empire to grow. That happened right early 1600s, which was that vision time. The British Empire really expanded during Pluto in power through that East India Trading Company arm in 1700s. It also was the French Empire. So that was the time of King Louis XIV. And he just kind of took over, and expanded and used taxes and built the army and started attacking the rest of Europe. When Pluto went out of bounds to the south, it was the French and American Revolution, which were both the beginnings of the end of the French and British empires. So, and when we look at who were the visionaries in the 1600s, early, it was uh, Francis Bacon, it was Descartes. So we have these European philosophers. It was also Galileo and science and Kepler and but Francis Bacon, I give a lot of credit to him, maybe not always good credit, but he's the one who funded the Jamestown colony, which became the colony where the first slave ships, enslaved people were carried back in 1619, right at the beginning of that vision cycle. So then we see kind of the rise and fall of the British Empire through that cycle. And so now this cycle is the rise and fall of the US empire, which
So,
really
yeah, go ahead.
which really was beginning in the 1860s. I mean, the country started with this democratic republic in the 1700s. It was almost exactly when Pluto was at its most extreme, out of bounds to the south, when the British um, backed out and left the country to us. Uh, but the 1860s was really this beginning of capitalism. And when that went on steroids, and when we have many corporations that were started, the big chemical corporations, the big pharmaceutical organizations, the Standard Oil, and the whole use of oil as it's become the backbone to our economy began in the 1860s with Rockefeller beginning his Standard Oil Company. So we have really, in a way, it's the US empire, but really what it more is corporate empire and the rise and fall of like corporate empire. And
So I love everything you're talking about because you're bringing in a new way of looking at this, and really solid research that you've been doing, and published in this book that I'm hoping to buy myself when we get off the Zoom call. But I did um, another show
Mhm.
where I looked at the parallels about some of this stuff and talked about, that things happen where the monarchy came and busted up the Catholic Church. And so it's like at this time, it's the corporations, it's the billionaire class, it's the like out of control capitalism that is the thing that ultimately we're kind of being distracted from with kind of these social issues. But when it's all said and done, it comes back to, you can only push people so far before then, things start to crumble. And one of the things that I've been listening a lot to, in some ways, I feel like AI and the technocrats and, the the inauguration where there was just a gallery of billionaires behind he who shall not be named. They have this very kind of interestingly dystopian view, and it goes very much back to, so almost like the India Trading Company, where it's like they think that there are certain people who should control everything and that they know better, and that everybody else should kind of just fall in line, and that's the vision. But it sounds like that vision that they're trying to reignite is not really the vision for this time, and their timing might be a bit off for this kind of new technocratic world that they're envisioning. So when did Pluto go out of bounds to the south? Has that happened yet?
It starts in September.
Okay.
So I love what you're saying, because tracking the East India Trading Company, I mean, was really the first international corporation. When Pluto went out of bounds to the south, back in that cycle, the 1700s, just before that, just before Pluto went out of bounds to the south, the East India Trading Company went into bankruptcy. And it really correlates with the 2008 crisis, where the corporation, there was a drought in India and production fell, and there was probably a lot of greed and corruption. And so once the East India Trading Company started to fall, the British Empire, the monarchy, felt like it needed to bail them out. And it literally said they were too big to fail. And so the way they bailed them out was taxing the colonists. And the colonists rose up in reaction to the taxes that were meant to bail out the East India Trading Company, which is exactly what we're seeing now, where these corporations have gotten too big to fail, and then it's the people are being taxed. And once we really see the effects of these taxes, particularly the current bill that just passed, once that falls, like, it's going to be uprising. That there's two other like trails that I want to follow here. One is about consciousness and an awakening, but let me talk about technology a little bit.
Okay.
Because when we look at the prior cycle, 1600, and we can look at other past cycles, it's all in the book. I talk about the Arabian Renaissance and what happened in the Mongolian Empire and the Roman Empire. Quickly, prior cycle, Galileo, telescope, microscope, changes the whole way science is being understood, perceived. When Pluto went out of bounds to the north, Newton did his work just before that, but when Pluto was out of bounds to the north, him controlling the mint and the money and his connection with Boyle and Locke, like, they were amassing power. So in this cycle, James Clerk Maxwell's equations are the equations for electricity and magnetism. They are the baseline for all the technology. When we got to Pluto out of bounds to the north, that was the beginning of the computers, right? That was Alan Turing, and that was the development of computing systems, IBM. He wasn't the only one, Turing. There was a lot that happened to make computers possible. When Pluto crossed at 0 degrees declination in the 1980s, that was the beginning of the internet, or at least the internet exploding. There were elements to the internet that were happening during World War II. What we're seeing now is the beginning of the decline of it. And it looks like because Pluto hasn't gone out of bounds yet, we can't see that, first of all, AI is nothing more than data accumulation. It's the same technology that's been used back to Edison's time, basically, turning switches on and off through electrical impulses. It is not a brand new technology. All it is using massive amounts of resources to collect more data and then throw that data out at us.
I
And
am so glad that you're saying that because I think there's a lot of people pinning things on AI that I don't necessarily think are the be all end all. Like, I don't know that that's going to be the breakthrough. I think that there are breakthroughs that can happen through it, but it's
right,
so resource dependent. And when we have this constant increase in pressure on our electric grids, and we have this constant pressure on our resources, such as water, how are we going to sustain that without extincting ourselves? And that's the
or
thing.
having to kind of move far more locally for our resources.
Right. And I think that's maybe a miscalculation on the part of the billionaires that think that they can just keep taking to the point of, you know,
Right.
the
Yeah, I think we
a
need to have
feudal
that.
society, right? Like that's kind of what it feels like is feudalism or, colonization almost.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I think there's a true lack of foresight, really. It's like taking technology and believing in it so much from just I want to say Mercury standpoint versus a Jupiter standpoint, which Jupiter brings in the wisdom and Mercury brings in just the binary zeros and ones. And I know there's like a deep element to Mercury that's about alchemy. But I think the new technology and the new breakthroughs will still have to do with with Maxwell's equations, but it is about magnetism. And because his equations really show us how to have free energy and how to have how to work with magnetism for free energy. We don't have to like reinvent new equations. They're already there, and there's already lots of people who've developed this. It's just that they've been oppressed through the building of the corporate empire. And as these systems break down because they're way too energy intensive, we have a few blackouts in a major city, and there'll just be this growing awareness. It's like at the brink. They have like about 2 years where they can sustain what they're doing now, maybe less. But within the next 10 years, as Pluto goes out of bounds, these we'll see these things fall. So the real like breakthroughs like around technology do have to do with the vision time when Pluto goes out of bounds to the south, but it can be about taking something that hasn't been developed but it's time for that now as people rise up and ask for that.
So when was the vision time for this Pluto out of bounds to the south cycle?
So it was the vision was 1860s.
Okay.
The justice time is 1980s. I think that may be what you're
Okay.
looking at. And that was, in lots of places in the world, there was like a real cry for justice. It was the Gorbachev years and the time of the falling of, and I know you've talked about this on your podcast, when the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell. I mean, the Soviet Union, you begin this cycle with some pretty extraordinary thinkers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, um, who were utopian thinkers or really asking some deeper questions. Chernyshevsky, I might have just said his name wrong, but he wrote this really popular book, What is to be Done, that was looking at utopian societies. And then you had the uprisings from that. You have World War II, which Stalin died, I think, the year or within a year of when Pluto left out of bounds. So
Mhm.
his rise and fall is almost perfectly when Pluto is out of bounds. And one of the things he did was nationalize the oil companies. So he took control of oil during that time period. So when Pluto was at 0 degrees declination, Gorbachev came in and started opening the doors to commerce. And then you had Chernobyl at the same time, and you had other oil factors, OPEC oil wars, um, the Middle East wars. So all of that kind of led to real transformation, particularly in Eastern Europe. We have Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. They have these Czechoslovakia. They have these uprisings that are peaceful and successful. And part of this, they have a blueprint for us now for how to uprise through singing, through taking a stance against an empire. So those countries are going to be role models for us as we go through this, which is, I mean, even what's going on in Ukraine right now, and I think the countries that are bordering Ukraine that are, in this suspended state in a way as that war continues on. But they have within their experience, 1980s wasn't that long ago, um, at least for some of us. uh, they had a successful uprising and saw the end of an empire. So I'm thinking that Russia is about to show us the way, and that they have had massive uprisings that aren't being televised. But I think Putin's on his way out. I actually think he's taking this kind of low profile right now, which might mean he's sick or just something is falling there. So it may not be this year when Pluto goes out of bounds for the first time, but it will be in the next couple of years. Because as Pluto goes out of bounds, it's like something erupts in us that wasn't even possible before. I don't think there was a sense of real possibility that there could be a whole country based on a democratic republic back in the 1700s. Sam Adams and, Voltaire, they were talking about these things, but the actual idea that the colonists could uprise and that the British Empire could back out, I think that was an extraordinary thing. And we see extraordinary things every time Pluto goes out of bounds. The prior cycle was the Reformation. I think it must have been hard to imagine that the Catholic Church, which owned most of the land of Europe, which owned the kings, the monarchies, everything went through them, that at some point these philosophers and theologians and preachers could start taking down the Catholic Church, which they did exactly as Pluto went out of bounds to the south back then. Martin Luther, he did his theses, 95 Theses. He did that before Pluto went out of bounds. He was like shouting, wake up, wake up. People woke up when Pluto went out of bounds to the south. We go back the prior cycle to that. It was Genghis Khan. What happened was Kublai Khan. And this he started wars, tried to build the empire, but it didn't work. And so his wars bankrupted the Mongolian Empire, and he turned all his focus into infrastructure and building these beautiful, building resources and creating resources for the people. So sometimes when there's some uprising, the leaders will go, oh yeah, I got to change tack here. That's what happened in the Roman Empire. There was uprisings, and then they took out Nero, and then they had 4 different emperors, and when Pluto was out of bounds to the south. And then finally they got Vespasian, who was a general, who stood in and said, okay, let's be done with the wars. Let's create infrastructure. Let's build up our aqueducts. Let's clear Nero's garden and put up the Colosseum. So we see extraordinary events that seem inconceivable to the people at the time happening just as soon as Pluto goes out of bounds.
Okay.
That's my hope.
I need to interrupt you.
Okay.
Are you going to lose your train of thought? Do you want to finish what
Nope.
you're saying? Okay. A couple different things. Does Pluto always go out of bounds when it's in Capricorn, Aquarius, or are there other signs that it does this?
Yeah, it's been out of bounds, N degrees of Capricorn to Aquarius. Yeah,
For the
I would,
south. And then to
The
the
south.
north, it's Leo and Cancer, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. What's interesting when you were talking about Russia, I know that there's been a lot of research. Nick Dagan Best has done a lot of research on the Astrology podcast with Chris Brennan about the Neptune and Saturn alignments with things happening in Russia. Then it's just so interesting the threads that you can pull. And you were sort of saying that there's uprisings taking place right now that are not being televised. And that was not remotely on my radar until today before we talked. Something popped into my feed and I started watching and I started kind of digging in and hearing like kind of this the situation on the ground in Russia is very different than anything that's being reported here in the US. Whereas like right now, there's still kind of this like all formidable Putin, but the truth of the matter is that they are built on an oil economy. And as the price of oil has been dropping significantly, it makes it that much more challenging for them to pay for this war that is become rather unpopular, and that there are actually food shortages taking place in that country right now, which I'm not seeing that in any of my news articles. I, see a bunch of garbage. And so, reading the European news can be really enlightening sometimes to see what's going on outside of, just North America. But in addition to that, there was an oligarch that tried to flee the other day
Mm.
and he was arrested. And they're like taking his billions and billions of rubles to help fund the war. So these are all kind of those signs
Yeah.
that Pluto might be about to go out of bounds for because if it sounds like the oil was an empire building, and then like here is this bill that we just passed in our own country which denies anything for renewable resources at the same weekend that there's a flood that kills 20 odd
Yeah.
children. There's like we're out of balance, and those are the kind of activities that I would think kind of raise the temperature for this. Is that aligning with your thinking?
Absolutely.
So these are all things that like, it's really interesting the synchronicities of like what's happening now with the cosmic energy. And then if you kind of get outside of the bubble of your news to see like, whoa, that, historical event mirrors this, and it won't look the same. But to your point, there may be more of a quote unquote revolution there first because, we don't have food shortages per se yet. We have other things going on, right? But that's when you really get people in the streets is when they can't eat.
Yeah. I also think the cycle tracks so perfectly with New York City.
Oh,
So, we see in the beginning, 1860s, the robber barons, but also the riots, the conscription riots, the whole Gangs of New York movie that was all based in 1863.
oh wow.
Um, and then how many of the corporations were supporting the Nazi Party in New York City in the beginning? And then 1987, we have this important time in terms of market crash in 1987. So the stock trading. So I think it's interesting that Zohran Mamdani, that election will be when Pluto is out of bounds. So, and Pluto will be out of bounds in September and October to give him traction. So, I mean, they've got a couple of months where they're still, are going to look like everything's fine, that they're still in power, but, and synchronistically, like there's massive synchronicity around all this. There'll be two eclipses in September, right? And they will be at Neptune and Saturn, and they will be, so Pluto goes out of bounds right in this portal of eclipse energy. As Uranus is stationing, there's an eclipse when Uranus is stationing at the Pleiades. It's so much activation that's happening in September. And so I think we'll see these movements, and I think New York City, which was the place where the Occupy movement started, I'm
It's
also
Wall Street,
transparency.
right? It's Wall Street. It's like greed is good. And, that ethos that we have been,
Yeah.
indoctrinated into, which was the beginning of everything kind of being stripped away. Like if you really look at like the real root of where this, current um, imbalance began was in the 80s under Reagan, right? And that
Exactly. I meant to bring that in. Yeah. So in the US and in England, there's the Thatcher,
Thatcher,
Reagan years where we were just blowing it off, and really the beginning of those tax breaks when Pluto was at 0 degrees declination were really the beginning of even a more massive transfer of wealth through taxation from the poor to the rich.
right. And it just has continued to accelerate no matter who is president. Like
Yeah.
I remember being incredibly frustrated with Obama cutting a deal to keep the Bush tax cuts going, right? It was like, when do we kind of address the bigger picture, which is like, how do we actually take care of what's happening in our country now? And if you listen to a lot of I've worked in Silicon Valley for over 20 years, incredibly disillusioned at this point. But I've been paying a lot of attention because Pluto is in Aquarius. I do see the darker side of tech being exposed, and I see what it's, social media has done over the past 20 years and accelerating the demise of civility in a lot of ways, and also just the levels of addiction. I mean, I'm addicted to my phone, and like I watch my child and I try to get him off of the screens, but like, and it's not the same as actually sitting in a room chatting with people watching TV. It really is a very different like level of engagement that you have, and they've proven like how it really messes with your brain. And so it's really interesting to hear these like Peter Thiel and Yarvin and all the people who are talking about where they see the future going. And it's just so antithetical to what I think the astrology is pulling us into. So I'm really glad that you did this research and it backs up
Mhm.
so much. So what do you make of the fact that this fall, all of those outer planets will be in retrograde and we will not be in this kind of new energy that we're in now? Like, how do you think that plays into it? Or do you think that doesn't play into it?
Well, I think the beginning is going to be the things falling apart.
Okay.
So,
Right, like it's almost
yeah.
like the culminate. So just for people watching, like Saturn, which is the social planet, but Saturn will be back in Pisces, Neptune will be back in Pisces, which a lot of the most recent challenges have
Mm.
come about during those two planets in Pisces. And Uranus will be as of November, so a little later, go back into Taurus. Pluto, however, will remain squarely in Aquarius, which I think we got on our side, right?
Yeah, well, I think Pluto going out of bounds and synchronistically those planets moving back into the Earth water energy, I think is the wake up call.
Okay.
Pluto during this time period, which is unlike other time periods, will only be going out of bounds for a couple of months every year. So it's not even going to stay out of bounds the whole 10 years. So it will go out of bounds like August to December most years. So Pluto will be back in bounds like in December. And it'll give us like a regrouping time, December, January. And we don't have eclipses, those planets are back in Earth water. It gives us a little bit of a time to like get reorganized, look at things, digest them, because I think a lot of it is how do we deal with our trauma, right? How are we like, are we feeling completely stuck, stymied? I mean, it's been shocking, really, I think, at least to me, like, even though I was ready for this in some ways, to watch how much is being dismantled so quickly, how many of our federal agencies are being dismantled. And I'm waiting
Science
to see kind of
and
what are the states going to respond to it? What's the legal system going to respond to it? What's the military? How is that going to respond to things? You know, who are they? Where's their allegiance? When is Higseth going to be gone? Because they can't like he's too unhinged, but we'll see we'll see an unhinged kind of energy right at the beginning, I think. And then I think 2026 will be a little more of a cohesive readiness to rise up. But I think it's also interesting that September is hurricane month. It's a month when it's likely to be fires. I mean, September is a tricky month to begin with. You throw in an eclipse at the world axis point, it's
Right. And Neptune going back into Pisces, and Saturn in Pisces as well.
and Uranus stationing right during
Uranus.
eclipse.
Right, during hurricane season when there's alligator Alcatraz being like, just, that I do kind of get this. And then again, I know I'm throwing a lot of different pieces in, but I get this kind of McCarthyism, like Jupiter and Cancer. McCarthyism was taking place during Jupiter and Cancer, but it reached a fever pitch to the point then was like, have you no decency, sir? And that's the piece, that's the only little like, is there a Jupiter in Cancer, like where it just finally goes too far and like people just really crave decency again and they crave civility and they crave kind of less of this chaotic energy, but it sounds like the chaos is here for a while. So, all right, now let's get to some nitty-gritty questions. Not that we haven't had nitty-gritty questions. This has been a really fascinating dialogue. So I'm so grateful for you coming on because I just love when different astrologers or psychics or tarot readers are coming at things and seeing the same things, but from a different perspective, because it almost feels kind of like this mandala or this seashell of just like there is some synchronicity that and yours is very well researched, and so that's what's really thrilling about your new book. Okay, so in these past Pluto out of bounds to the south uh cycles, okay, the revolution comes then. So here's the thing that I think a lot of people there, I have extremes. I watch a lot of different astrologers. I talk to a lot of different astrologers. I have one astrologer who's like worried about nuclear war. I have another one who's like, I think it'll be like a global awakening and everyone will be singing Kumbaya. Like there's just these like crazy extremes. And sometimes I want to bring people back and be like, I don't necessarily think it's either of those things. I look at what revolutions looked like in the past. And there's like the Velvet Revolution, which was like chill, but then there's some pretty bloody revolutions, right? And so do you have a sense of timing as far as like, okay, when Pluto's out of bound to the south, like you can have a pretty chill revolution, or no, it tends to be pretty intense. And also, does it last? Is it like varied how long it lasts? Does it last the whole cycle? Is that too much to ask you?
No, I'm totally enjoying talking to you, but so in my book, I cover 5 different potential outcomes, five different things that I've seen happen. So the one that's most difficult is the collapse. The best example of like a total systems, everything collapses is back in the Bronze Age. Eric Klein wrote this great book, 1177 BC, and he talks about the collapse that happened back then, where there was all these world empires, and within a 10-year time period, Pluto was out of bounds to the south, and boom, they were gone. But what happened is people moved into more local tribal states. Um, so so the 5 things are collapse, then there's revolutions that are bloody and nasty and horrible, some quashed, some, then there's benevolent rulers. So sometimes we see a real shift in rulership and leadership where the uprisings start and the rulers kind of wake up and say, okay, we're going to focus on infrastructure. We're not going to focus on empire expansion. I think in this current cycle, nonviolent demonstration has been a significant part of what's developed over since the 1860s. The 1860s was Ramakrishna, who inspired Gandhi, Tolstoy, who inspired Gandhi. So we have these people who are talking about nonviolent resistance that have been developing during the cycle. And one of the things that happened in World War II was Gandhi was doing his fasting, and that led to the freedom of India from the British Empire, or at least contributed to that. So then there's paradigm shifts. There's like technological revolutions that shift things. There's the printing press was developed in when Pluto was out of bounds to the north. It wasn't invented then by Gutenberg, but it was developed. That contributed, just like the computers contributed to a lot of education that contributed to the Reformation. So sometimes we see paradigm shifts. And then there's the fifth option, which is something that's never happened before, which would be a global consciousness awakening. Because this is the last time Pluto goes out of bounds, why not go out with a bang? Why not have us all really wake up? So I'm holding that out. I'm looking for signs of that. I think they're all happening simultaneous. I think different countries will go through this differently. When we look at the past one, Pluto went out of bounds around 1775, 76. So the colonists took real great advantage of that. And so when Pluto is out of bounds to the most extreme, 1783 was really when the Britain pulled out and we started our country. The French didn't start their revolution until after that. And so when revolutions start late or too late in the cycle, they tend to be bloodier or tend to be so the things that we see starting soon will more likely to be more peaceful or more effective.
Okay.
So, and in fact, the things that start precisely as Pluto goes out of bounds tend to be the most successful. So if they start too early, they're bloody. If they start too late, they're bloody.
Yeah, it's almost
Yeah.
like the leaders are not paying attention to the signs from the gods, right? Like the energetic
Yeah, why aren't they astrologers?
signposts, right? Like
Or maybe
um
they are.
well, and I always hold up for people to have an awakening of consciousness. I think I read too much news and too many comment sections to be as optimistic as I should be. I think that I will hopefully get to a point where I'm meditating again daily and I can put that energy out into the world because I really do hope more people do wake up. And there might be a lot of people waking up, but it's kind of like the thing where I didn't know what was happening in Russia. Like I can't see it, right? Because that's not the narrative being given, right? I do think that there are more people um, in my immediate life and even with myself that are having kind of awakenings. Like I'm kind of realizing
That's what I think is happening. I think we're having them personally right now. And it's subtle. It's not because we're
subtle.
meditating.
Yeah.
Like I think we're having a subtle consciousness shift where we're starting to be aware of things, hearing things, understanding things, tuning into things that we couldn't see or understand before. And I think it's happening in the midst of these horrible, atrocious things that are happening in the world. And I imagine it's even happening there as well.
Yeah, and I think one of my sort of awakenings is that there we have to play our individual role, but it may not look like the individual role of another person. Everyone's got their kind of
Right.
own individual role, and that is part of the awakening is being present and not catastrophizing,
Right.
because I'm the queen of that. And I think a lot of people that are following the
That's
news closely, like we're like, oh, could be the end of the world. That's like, the end of the world's been predicted a lot and has not happened. And there is the end of the world for a lot of other people, but is that the end of the world? Is there something bigger? There is kind of this like taking a step back and recognizing like this is all like historical patterns and we are not special and nothing new is taking place that hasn't taken place before. It's kind of a wheel, right? It's like the wheel in the tarot card. And the more you can kind of get into that understanding, that this was an awakening for me to live in the present as like, I can't control this outcome,
right.
but
Yeah.
my individual role is to give voice to what's happening, to try to tell people to keep the faith, don't have false hope, but do your part,
Yeah.
be a good person, like pay attention, but don't pay attention to the point that your nervous system is so racked out.
Yeah.
And know that like there is some cosmic hand of God taking place and whatever that means to you, right?
Yeah.
So, is there anything that, advice that you give people to prepare for this upcoming transit or out of bounds or anything like that? Everybody has their own role, is what I say, but I would love to hear your perspective.
Well, I totally agree. We all have our own places. I like to track Saturn as it goes through the houses to determine like what your role is. And so if if Saturn's just in your second house, like it is time to step back and manage your resources. But if Saturn's in your 10th, then get out there, If Saturn's in your third, start communicating, start talking. Like I like to track Saturn as kind of the most realistic of the planets, right? And also, I do have another workbook that's coming out. I'm trying to get it done. That is about finding your role in the revolution. So it looks
Hmm.
at your ascendant as a spiritual path, and then it goes into looking at timing your generation that you're part of, where was Pluto when you were born, which generation, and then it goes into uh, looking at how to activate the four main archetypes of warrior, teacher, visionary, and healer, and how to activate those through your chart.
Oh my
So
God, Rosie, where have you been all my life? How do I not know you? This is so
I know.
awesome. These
It
are
does
all the
seem
things
like we
I
should know
love.
each other. Yeah, it's
Oh
really
my
fun to
God.
talk to you. Uh,
So you have to promise me right now. Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I hope when that's done that you'll come back and
I'd
talk
love
about
to.
that, because that sounds so fascinating and like another great conversation. So, okay, so I'm going to recap for everybody. One, you need to go buy Rosie's book. You-
Here we go.
All right, there we go. Give me the title again. I'm just
Persephone's
on my mind.
Revolution, Pluto's Path to the End of Empire.
Okay. I'm sorry.
And
Okay.
if you go to my website, rosiefinn.com, you can buy it through Psychic Sister. You could buy it through the publisher, Revelor Press, which is a local publisher, astrology publisher, Jen Zard. She's amazing. And then, or you could buy it through Amazon.
Okay. All right. So that's number one. Number two, if you don't know that much about astrology and you want to learn about astrology, I have my foundations course
Mhm.
that just for the month of July, I reduced the price by half. It is all pre-recorded and you have lifetime access to it. So that is something that I think if you are a little lost about where Saturn is going to be in your chart in the coming year, that would give you that foundation of understanding like, where is Saturn in my own chart and where will it be? So that's just a little plug for that. Please like, subscribe, share. This is such a fascinating conversation. All right, closing it up here. Pluto is going out of bounds to the south in September. We can expect some pretty dramatic collapse at that time. Just don't panic. This is all part of the plan to get us to a better place. And throughout history, that's part of what has happened. And you can learn more about this cycle through Rosie's book. So fascinating. I love it all. And it does mirror so many other things that other people are saying. And it just gives us a little timing as well. So maybe then that means we can like kick back for the rest of the summer and go on vacation.
Yeah, I
Maybe.
mean, I think so. Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
I
take a news
started,
break.
and I want to say in September, like I'm going to be in France doing a workshop. If anyone wants to join me there,
Oh yeah, plug that. Yeah, because maybe people are like ready for a vacation. Get ready before the revolution.
yeah, it's going to be during that first eclipse weekend, September 5th to the 7th. I'm going to be in the sacred site in Burgundy, France, and it's going to be super cool with somebody who does cell meditation. We're just going to,
Okay,
so
so will that be on your website as
yeah,
well?
that's on my
Okay.
site. Um, and I want to say, do what you feel really called to in September. Like, don't be like afraid, like I'm traveling. Like it's not about like staying home. It's about doing what you're called to do and just paying just a little bit more attention to it when we have these big transits.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. Well, thank you for your time. And as always, everyone, this illustrates there is a reason and a season for it all, and the cosmos is conspiring to help us. So, and until next time, I hope you come back on, Rosie. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.